Hello, everybody. Welcome to Lunch with PB&J.
Yes. Hello.
That's quite welcome. We are back with another episode. I got something in my eye. Like, as soon as I hit record, something flew into my eye. So we're back, and we are continuing in Ephesians, but now we are in Ephesians chapter 6. Where were you going with that first one? Ephesians chapter 6 is where we're at, but we have not changed topics.
Right.
We are still talking about submitting to the Lord, and what does that look like in different relationships. And so that's what we're going to be talking about today. We are talking about parents and kids, or kids and parents. And so if you are a kid out there, if you are a kid to some parent, or a parent to some kid.
Hey, I know some kids that listen to this. So.
Do you?
Yeah.
Hey, our kids?
Yes. Randomly, they listen.
Randomly, every once in a while. Yeah, it is funny because randomly they'll throw out something we said on a podcast.
And
I'm
like, oh, you listen?
That's weird. But anyway. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. But if this is your first time in a long time, you know why? It's because you haven't followed us yet. So why don't you go ahead, hit the follow button, hit that subscribe button so that you never miss an episode. You always know when we're popping up. Go ahead and follow us on Instagram, on Facebook. On Instagram, it's Lunch with PB&J _ podcast. And on Facebook, it's just Ben Booth, parentheses, Joy. It's like I'm giving her a hug. We're one of those couples that has the shared Facebook page.
Yes.
Because Joy thinks Facebook is of the devil.
Yes.
So she refuses to have her own Facebook page, but she's actually on Facebook more than I am.
I don't know about that.
That's okay. I don't mind. Up until that time that she told our old pastor's wife that she looked gorgeous.
And didn't tag my name.
And didn't tag her name. And I said, you should probably start tagging your name so it doesn't look like I'm commenting to random friends that I think their wives are gorgeous. So that was a little awkward. But we got past it, and we figured out a way. So if you ever read our Facebook page and you're like, why does Joy always put her name at the end of everything? Now you know why.
That would be why.
All right. So that has nothing to do with what we're going to talk about today. That's just a fun fact about Ben and Joy. All right. Today we are in Ephesians chapter 6, just 4 little verses.
Yes.
4 little verses,
wow.
But a lot there. Some stuff I'd never, I got to be honest with you. I didn't really see the one thing in there before. It's, how you read something over and over again, you just kind of focus on one part of it.
Yeah.
That's kind of what happened to me. So, again, we begin a new chapter, but we're still getting examples of what it means to submit to one another as followers of Christ. So the reason that we submit to one another is we do it out of honor or respect to Jesus. And so we submit to him first, and then from that we submit to others, which really just is about giving honor and respect to those around us as well that we're in relationship with. So first we talked about wives submitting to their husbands, and we talked about what submission looks like for husbands when it comes to their wives, and now we're going to talk about the kids and the parents. So I am going to read. But what I want to do is I'm going to read verse 21 from Ephesians chapter 5.
Okay.
Because it says, and further submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Then it's wives, husbands, and then we come to chapter 6. Children, obey your parents because you belong to the Lord. For this is the right thing to do. Honor your father and mother. This is the first commandment with a promise. If you honor your father and mother, things will go well for you, and you will have a long life on the earth. We'll read verse 4 later.
Okay.
But this deals with kids. So let's deal with the kids first.
Gotcha.
And then we'll deal with the parents. How's that sound? So I read this, and my immediate thought was that old joke that you see on pretty much every sitcom that's ever existed, where at some point the parents and the kids are arguing with each other. and
I think I know what you're gonna say.
And the parent tells the kid to do something, and the kid's like, "Why do I have to listen to you?" Or "Why do I have to do that?" And the parent says, "Because I said so." Right?
Yeah.
And so it's been on every sitcom that involves parents and kids since the beginning of television. Well, according to Paul here, a more accurate answer for a child that believes in Jesus.
Yeah.
So again,
Why do I have
these
to listen to you?
relationships are between individuals who are followers of Jesus Christ. And what Paul says here is the most accurate reason for why a child should obey their parent is not because the parent told them so, but it is actually because it is the right thing to do, because you belong to Christ. So why do we obey our parents? Because we belong to Christ.
Yeah, I think it's such a reflection. You see, it's such a reflection. Our relationship, or our relationships that we have. You know, we went over the husband and wives, and it's such a reflection that you see there about Christ and the church. But then here, it's also a reflection to that authority, where if a child obeys their parent, they're also obeying God, right? Where you see this kind of, it's a reflection of their relationship with God. So that word obey means, in different, I always like to kind of look a little bit deeper into definitions. It means to listen attentively. Like I liked that. It's just that you're hanging on their every word. Like
Right.
it's the listen attentively thing. You know, Ben's got this saying about with our kids, what is it? Delayed obedience is not obedience, you know, because it's like, especially with one of them, I won't say who it is in case they're listening, but it's like, you know, hey, go get the laundry. 10 minutes goes by, 15 minutes goes by, and you're like, did they hear me? You know, was it? So it's that, I just liked that wording, listen attentively. Like it's an immediate, it's a response. It's not just I'll get around to it. You know, it's obedience in its purest form. It means to heed, to come under their authority. And you know, we've talked about it before, but it's this thing where you're coming under this authority and this structure, and when you're fighting the structure of coming under that parent, if you're really fighting, you know, the authority of God too. So I think it's always something that we shouldn't forget in these structures of authority that God has placed, because God has placed them. If you find yourself, you're fighting it, or you're rebellious, or you're not heeding, you know, that authority, then you need to understand, in reality, you're fighting the authority of God. So I think it's just always good to understand that and come back to that knowledge. And then again, that because you belong to the Lord, same thing you're saying, where we can't forget who he's talking to. He's talking to Christian children. You know, he's talking to Christian families. So it's that obey your parents because you belong to me. Yeah. Because I have put this structure in place. So I think if you were to tell a kid that's not growing up in a Christian home, or they're not Christians, you know, because you obey your parents, sometimes these things don't make sense because they don't come natural, right? But it's when it's obey your parents because you belong to God. We are made new creatures. Yeah. And it's not just parents that are made new creatures. Children are too. Yeah. Children get saved. They follow God, you know, even at very young ages. So you come back to just exactly what you said earlier of because he's speaking to Christian families. And then the why. Why should you obey? Same thing you said. I thought that was funny. It's not just because I said so, but it's the right thing to do. God says it's the right thing to do. And that word right, you know, again, you go into a deeper, it's the righteous thing to do. It's the holy thing to do. So this is not just, it's the right thing to do to listen to my parents. It's literally God's will. It's the righteous thing to do. It's God's will. And not to get too much on a sidetrack, but like we spend so much of our lives, whether we're younger or older or whatever phase we're in, we spend so much time going, you know, what's God's will for me? And like some of these simplistic things that are in the Bible, we need to come back to them and say, God, this is your will for me. Yeah. You've already laid out so many things plainly. And it's God's will for children to obey their parents.
Yeah. And I thought, again, keeping it within the context is why I keep going back to verse 21
Yeah.
and then leading into all of these relationships. It's this idea that Paul, first, he really showed the strength of marriage lies in two individuals submitting to Christ first and then submitting to one another. Like
Yeah.
that's the strength of marriage. And now just seamlessly flows into, and you say, well, it's a new chapter, isn't it? Again, I always make this point just in case it's the first time listening. The Bible was not, when Paul wrote this, he wrote it as a letter. It
Yeah.
was not in chapters and verses, all right? That was something translators put in just to kind of help them translate, keep everything in order. But there's no break in this
It's
thought.
such a flow, yeah.
This is a flowing thought here. And so now he's showing the strength of family. So he showed the strength of marriage, two individuals being submitted to Christ first and then to one another. And now he shows the strength of family lies in everyone submitting to Christ first
Right.
and then to each other. And so again, there will be instructions here. We're starting with the child, but then there's instructions for the parent. So it's again, in submitting to Christ, this is how you're going to interact with people. So as you submit to Christ, kids, this is how you interact with your parents. And then in verse 4, it will be as you submit to Christ, fathers, this is how you submit to your kids. Parents, this is how you submit to your kids. And so again, like just kind of, you said a lot of what I was going to say of just, that idea of it's right. And it is. It's the fact that it's right because it's what God put into motion.
Yeah.
God has placed an order within nature. There's a way that things are supposed to work, and not only in nature but in relationship. And you see that throughout the Bible.
Well, I think like last week we talked about it with the husband and wives, but it applies to this as well, where it creates harmony in the home. Why did God put this structure in place? Because He knows what's best, and He knows what's going to harmonize. He knows what's going to fit for the well-being of everybody.
And this is such a crucial thing to understand, that the reason kids are to obey their parents is because it's part of the order that God has put into place.
Yeah.
And that's something that's, again, it's crucial that we understand this, because what that means is that kids don't run the home.
Yeah.
And too often, being in the position that we're in as pastors, we've heard parents say before, well, the reason we haven't been coming to church is because little Johnny doesn't like it. Little Susie got up today. These aren't actual kids in our church, just so you know. John, we do have a Johnny in our church. I'm not talking about Johnny, all right?
He's a good kid.
Johnny's a good good kid and loves to come to church. But, talking about their kids don't want to come, or they were tired, or this or that. And the reason that they're not bringing their kids to church is because the kids are making the decisions in the home.
Yeah.
And that's not the structure and order that God has set up.
Yeah.
And so as a parent, and this is what you'll see when it gets to the parent, is we have been given this responsibility,
Right.
to lead, to lead these kids, and then the kids are to follow. They are to obey. Even I feel like there's even somewhat of a, not even somewhat, it's becoming more and more, you're seeing this in the culture more and more with kids. It's being said, well, kids just need to choose their own path. This comes down to gender and a lot of other things at a younger and younger age. It's like these kids need to be able to choose what they want for their lives. They need to choose this and choose that. And yet that is going against the order that God has set in place, where we are the parents and we are to raise and instruct our kids from that young age until they get to a place of understanding and knowing.
And causing so much harm.
Yeah, and this is what you're seeing is more and more, it's just causing so much harm. And so to understand, or there's another parental thought of just, well, once my kids turn, and it's getting, again, younger and younger, 3 and 4 years old, where we're sending our kids to school, and we're going to let the schools instruct them. We'll let the school instruct them. Or there's parents that send their kids to church, and we're going to let, that's their education in terms of God, is that hour and a half that they spend in church once a week. And that's being generous.
Basically just not taking
but,
the responsibility, the very serious responsibility
and
that's been given.
This is, God has ordained that a parent would raise a child. This is the way it's always been. This is the order that God set down. And so it's right. And it's not just right for the child to obey the parent, but for the parent to give something to the child to obey.
Right.
Yeah.
So it kind of goes in line with what you're saying, and I feel like, oh, maybe I don't have to say this, but I'm going to, because, I've said it in the past too with the other ones, but, if a parent is asking a child to sin, then obviously the Bible is not saying obey that. Right? Because we can go back to Acts 5:29, and again, I've used that verse before, where Peter says to the council there, they're saying, stop preaching Jesus' name. Stop it. Stop preaching. And then he says, we must obey God rather than man. And I like the way it's worded too. It says, we must obey God rather than any human authority. And that's where, so, you have these human authorities that are put in place. God puts these structures in place. But any time that they are asking you to sin or go against God, we're not talking about that.
Yeah.
So I'll put that out there.
And then he goes on. He says this is he says it's the first commandment with a promise. So we can't miss the fact that also it's called a commandment. And why is it called a commandment?
It's the 10 Commandments.
Because it's a commandment. It was literally a commandment. To be specific, it is the fifth commandment. It's covering my notes so she couldn't cheat.
I wouldn't have known if I didn't look it up, though. I just couldn't tell on myself.
So it is the fifth of the 10 commandments that a child is to honor, to obey their father and mother. And it comes with this promise that is there afterwards. I'm going to get to this down here in a second. But so again, I think it's important to understand, sometimes people will say, well, the 10 commandments are in the Old Testament. Jesus established a new law, a new covenant. So Jesus did not abolish the law specifically. He definitely did not abolish the 10 commandments because the 10 commandments were from God. They were for his people. They really are a revelation.
Foundation for godly living.
They're a revelation of the holiness of God, the standard that God sets before us. It's how when Jesus didn't get rid of them. They said, what's the greatest? He said to love God and love others. And all he did was really kind of compartmentalize those 10 commandments. Six go towards loving others, and 4 go towards loving God. And so it's not something he put them all together into those 2. But he says it's a command. And what is the command? To honor our parents. And to honor our parents is so much more than just simple obedience. I think that's an important thing to understand. When we talk about honor, it means that it's not just sitting in here and going begrudgingly. Sometimes your kids obey, but it's not because they want to obey. It's because they're scared of the consequences. They don't want the consequences of not obeying. But it means to show respect.
It almost makes me feel like it's like encompassing, I'm not sure if I'm saying that word right, an attitude about yourself, like an attitude of how you treat.
So yeah, because I think the way that we honor our parents is not just in simply listening and doing what they say, but it is that showing respect and love and that we care for them in the sense of we're going to do what they want. And so it's also in how we live our lives is how we show honor to our parents. It's this thing of the greatest compliment I can get as a parent is when somebody sees my kid out doing something on their own, and they're doing, and their actions and the way they speak and the way they behave, because everything they do is a reflection on us as parents. And so when people come back and go, you have such great kids, that to me,
honoring their
that
father,
is them living a life that honors us as parents. And I thought of, it blew my mind. All right. I don't know if Joy remembers this or not, but when we got married, before we got married, I did the thing. I went and asked her dad for his daughter's hand in marriage, and we had a little talk and all that stuff. And
my dad tried to act all scary,
and I just listen. Didn't intimidate me at all. And so no, we had a great conversation, and he's an awesome guy, and it was just and it was good. But I remember talking to Joy, and I can't remember if you asked me. I think you asked me if I had talked to your dad after I proposed. I think you did ask me one day if I'd asked your parents or asked your dad and stuff, and I had. And then I asked her, I said, what would you have done if he said no? And she goes, I wouldn't have been able to marry you. And it blew my mind. It honestly, it blew my mind. I think it
upset him for a little bit.
It upset me a little bit. I'm like, are you telling me you wouldn't? But it was, and she quoted this verse, and it was out of honor to her parents. If her parents were not on board with us getting married.
So it absolutely.
And it was the right thing. It was the right answer.
It was absolutely honoring your father and mother, but
I'd have won them over.
But it was also, there's such a level of trust too, when you have that relationship with your parents. That doesn't mean they're perfect. No, it doesn't mean they're perfect, but it's that trust level of, hey, they're gonna see something I don't see, or they're gonna know something that I don't know. You know, because as we go further, we'll see like the role of that parent is to instruct. And so, yeah, I think that's that trust level that comes from knowing they know more than I do. Especially, you know, those younger years when you're very dependent on.
Yeah. And so I think that's the level of honor that's talked about here, though, as well. That's the level of honor, which then goes into the promise.
Yeah.
So the promise, it says this is the first commandment with the promise. So
is that what you said you'd never seen before?
Yeah. Is this part. And so, so again, it's the fifth commandment. And if you go back and read them, you got 4 commandments, and then it's the fifth commandment.
Yeah.
But the first one that comes with the promise.
Yeah.
And the promise is, you can read it in Exodus chapter 20, verse 12. But it says, then you will live. So honor your father and mother, or obey your father and mother. And then it says, then you will live a long, full life in the land the Lord your God is giving you. And now, originally this was obviously written to the Jews, the 10 Commandments. But Paul applies it to the current believers. So not just the believers in his day, but us as well.
Right.
And by what he does is simply changes the land promise to the earth you live in.
Yeah.
Just meaning that you're going to have a better life. It's going to be a better life. And everything will be well with you, and you will live a long life. Now, it doesn't mean you'll be immortal if you obey your parents. It doesn't mean if a child dies young that they did something to dishonor their parent, all right? It's not saying that. It's this principle of, if we will obey our parents, especially when we are children of parents who are believers as well, because again, this is the relationship Paul's speaking into, right? And so he says, if you will obey your parents, you will avoid, what will happen is you'll avoid a lot of sin, a lot of hurt, a lot of pain and danger in life, because your parents are going to give you instructions. It might save you from a bad marriage if her dad says, you know what, I think this Ben guy's shady. You know, and Joy listens to that and doesn't just go with the fact that she was crazy in love with me. And, you know.
You're making it sound like he didn't agree.
He absolutely agreed.
They thought he hung the moon. Still right. do.
And so, this is the principle that he's talking about. And this is what he talks about of having, everything will be well with you.
Right.
You'll live a long life. It means that if you follow, especially, again, if our parents are submitted to Christ as well, there's a lot of, like, I can remember talking to our kids, and a lot of times I give them instructions, and when I give them instructions, it's like, dude, when I was your age, I've made some stupid choices, you know, and I had great parents, and they instructed me, and there was areas where I disobeyed and kind of did things behind their back. Mom and Dad, you know about most of it now. If you're listening to this, you know most of it. You know, there's certain things that were there, but I look back on it and go, if I would have just obeyed my parents, it would have saved me from some of those things.
In hindsight.
Right.
Yeah.
And so obedience, that's that part of obedience. Man, it really does make everything.
Well, so I read that, and I just, again, it's funny that you said you'd never seen that before, because I kind of felt the same way of, wow, there's a promise that comes with this.
Yeah.
So I didn't know it, but it's just like it becomes alive to you. That promise of, things are going to go well with you. You're going to have a long life. And who doesn't want that? Like we all want that. We all want our lives to go well and things to go well and to stay out of trouble and drama and bad things. We all want that. We all want to have a long life. And I started to look at this just from the practical sense of like, okay, obeying your parents, saving you, obeying your parents, and then this promise being applied to your life, it'll go well and you're going to have a long life. Like, I just started to look at it from that practical sense of, your parents are full of literally life-saving advice, right?
Yeah.
It's the, look both ways before you cross the street. It's don't stick your finger in the socket, don't put that up your nose. We had kids that do that. Like, eat your vegetables, they're good for you, all these, and we kind of, hey, that's funny, but literally these things that our parents put in us from a very young age.
Yeah.
And then the older we get, they get more serious of, don't do drugs, don't sleep around, don't hang out with that crowd, don't, the things get more serious. And then as we're adults, there's still, if you have hopefully a good relationship with your parents, they can still pour into you and give you good advice. Mm-hmm. But I just looked at it from that common sense aspect of, here's a promise, because it makes sense to me. It makes sense to me because I do this every day. I am pouring life-saving advice into my little children every day, And whether they're listening or not, I hope they're listening, but right? Yeah. We do this every day. Because I was just thinking about it from that practical sense of it makes sense. But then you look at it on that deeper level. So if non-Christian families are giving their kids good advice, then think about what Christian families, think about the advice they're giving their children. The spiritual advice, the spiritual life-saving, good instruction that they're giving them. So yeah, it just made sense to me that you see by if we'll listen, and at the time it just sounds like wah 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 wah, it doesn't really hit home. Yeah. But then you become parents, and you're like, oh, I get it now.
Absolutely.
They were trying to save me from something.
And on the opposite side, so when you look at obedience, you have to look at the opposite side of that.
Disobedience.
So you have disobedience. And so to really understand, I think sometimes to really understand what the Bible is saying about something, you have to look at both the positive, like exactly what it's saying, but also, okay, what is the contrasting thought to that? Because that helps me understand sometimes when I look at the contrasting thought as well. And so the contrasting thought is obviously disobedience. So disobedience to parents is considered, and this is strong, but this is what it talks about in other passages in Romans 1 and 2 Timothy 3. Disobedience to parents is considered rebellion against God.
Look, I wrote it down.
Did you? There you go.
So this is actually comes from, was it Samuel? Where is it? 1 Samuel? Samuel. I don't have my scripture right here. But it's Samuel, and he is talking to Saul, and it's that statement that we probably heard before, rebellion is as sinful as witchcraft. That's powerful. That's powerful.
Is this where he was talking to Saul?
Yes.
Yeah. This is where the whole delayed obedience is disobedience.
Oh, that's where that comes from. Yeah, that's an interesting, so it's, 1 Samuel 15, if you want to go back and look at like what God says about how important obedience is. Even that obedience is better than sacrifice. And I kind of reword that too, to my understanding. Obedience is better than saying, I'm sorry. Here's my sacrifice. I'm sorry. Obedience. God desires it.
Yeah. And so understanding that it, and so in those passages in Romans 1, 2 Timothy 3, they're talking about really the corruption of the world. And in there, one of the things that it says, like, if you want to know when times are getting rough, one of the things will be children are disobedient to their parents.
I wrote that down, but
and
not
that's
in these
towards
papers.
That's towards the end of the world.
So 2 Timothy 3:3, if I have
that's right.
If I have it right, it's literally disobedient children are a sign of the end times. I thought that, like, that's interesting because have you ever said, or probably me too, just like it's rampant. Yeah. It's like children don't obey their parents anymore at all, So that's interesting. That's kind of a side note, but it's interesting that the Bible tells us that, hey, this will be a sign that these are the end days.
And if you want to know why that's so important, all you have to do, I say all you have to do, it actually involves quite a bit of work. But if you go back and you look at the process of education, you look at different parenting styles and the parenting books and education on parenting and things like that are put in place, parenting styles that are put in place. If you go back to you ever hear like when I was a kid, you hear grandparents talk about when I was a kid, and and they're saying that to their kids who are now parenting their grandkids, and you're like, but you parented the kids that are parenting those kids now. And anyway, you can get into all that, but
if you look at like
you follow the
50
trends,
years ago, because we would look and talk to our parents, but 50, 60 years ago, it would be this thing of obeying your parents was the norm, not. Oh, that's those freaky
so you look
Christians over there.
Yeah, you look at the influence of entertainment on society, where kids today are portrayed in shows for comedic purposes as being disobedient, or they know better than the stupid parents, and so you watch, different shows and stuff like that, and you see, and it's all played off for comedy, but it breeds this in the kids. And I know it sounds like we're just holy rollers and stuff, but you got to understand, like, you look back and follow the trends and the patterns as it goes through, and what you'll begin to learn is that why is it a big deal? Is because disobedient kids lead to rebellious adults, and that's why it matters. And so you begin to see a generation of kids that were allowed to run the home, that everything was about them and whatever they wanted to do, and then they grow into adults that feel like everything should still be about them, that it's all about them, it's not about other people, the world should just respond, and they don't know how to handle the fact that the world doesn't just bend over backwards for them, because they weren't raised that way as kids. They were allowed to be disrespectful, they were allowed to be disobedient, and so then they carry that into adulthood, and they can't figure out why they can't hold down a job, and why people get mad at them, why they don't have friends.
It matters. These foundational things matter.
And so this is why obedience matters. These are the foundational things. So kids, as you submit, if you believe in Jesus, and again, we're saying kids and we picture little kids, but this is little kids, this is teenagers, this is adults. Joy was an adult when I proposed to her.
But it's also this thing of, I was still under the structure and authority of my father's house. I wasn't living on my own, and like that's why too, it's just this, I hadn't come out from underneath that authority. And so there's still that honor that we give to our parents no matter where we are in life, but that's for the kids. Now we go to verse 4, and it says, hey guys, we're going to call it an end right there for today. We've talked about what it looks like for a child that is submitting to Christ, how they submit by obeying their parents. And so we've talked about that this week. Next week we're going to pick up at verse 4. We're just going to cover one verse. Can you imagine that? One verse. But this time we do it? Yes, we can.
Can we make a whole episode out of one verse? 100% we can. All right. And we're going to talk to the parents next week. And I think it's there is a lofty responsibility that God has given to us as parents. And so we hope you'll join us right here next time on the podcast. So for now, I want to thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. Be sure to share this with somebody that you know. Like it, subscribe to it, follow us, all those good things. Let us know what you think, and we will see you next week right here on Lunch with PB&J.
Bye, guys.